What would you do if the world took everything from you? If the person who was your sun, your moon, and all your stars was suddenly extinguished, leaving you in a cold and silent darkness? For Alara, this was not a question. It was the reality she breathed every day in the house that was no longer a home, but a museum of a life that was over. The air was thick with the scent of her late husband, Matteo, a phantom aroma of sawdust and old spice that clung to the curtains and the worn armchair where he used to sit. Grief was not a visitor in her house. It was the landlord. She had once been a woman of faith, one who found comfort in the familiar cadence of hymns and the scent of old incense in the town's small, stone church. But when Matteo was taken by a sudden sickness that doctors could not name and God would not heal, her faith had crumbled like dry earth. It had not just disappeared. It had been replaced by something hard and bitter, a resentful stone in the center of her soul. She looked at the world, at the pious faces of her neighbors, and felt only a scornful pity. Their prayers were empty, sounds in an empty sky. Her garden, once a vibrant tapestry of color that she and Matteo had tended together, was now a riot of weeds and decay. Thorns choked the life from the rose bushes he had so lovingly planted. The paint on her front door was peeling, and the windows were grimy, veiled against a world she no longer wished to see. Alara had become a ghost in her own life, haunting the rooms where laughter once echoed, her only companion the relentless ache of memory. It was on a gray Tuesday, the kind of day that mirrored the landscape of her heart, that Mr. Anya came to her door. He was a small, stooped man with eyes that held the gentle sadness of a long and faithful life. His wife, Maria, had passed a year before Matteo, and he carried his own loneliness with a quiet dignity that Alara found irritating. He held out a small object wrapped in a faded linen cloth. "For you, Alara," he said, his voice as soft as dust. "Maria would have wanted you to have it." Alara took the bundle reluctantly. It was heavy for its size. She unwrapped it to reveal a small statue of the Virgin Mary, no more than a foot high. It was old, the blue of the mantle chipped in several places, the plaster face serene but weathered, as if it had witnessed 1,000 sorrows. The tiny, outstretched hands were worn smooth. She prayed to it every morning. Mr. Anya continued, a faint tremor in his voice. "It gave her peace. Perhaps it can offer you some as well." Alara felt a hot surge of anger. Peace. What did this old man and his plaster doll know of the chasm in her life? She wanted to laugh, to mock the simple, useless gesture. But the hope in his eyes was so fragile, so sincere, that she could not bring herself to break it. Instead, she manufactured a thin, brittle smile. "Thank you, Mr. Anya," she said, the words feeling like shards of glass in her mouth. "That is very kind." She closed the door and stood for a long moment, the cool weight of the statue in her hands. It was an idol of a faith that had abandoned her, a symbol of promises that God had broken. It represented a cosmic betrayal. With a sigh of disgust, she placed it on the mantelpiece, amidst the dust-covered photographs of Matteo, and turned her back on it. The plaster saint stood silent, a patient and unwelcome guest in a house where all hope had died. The call came a week later, shattering the fragile quiet of her self-imposed exile. It was her daughter, Sarah, her voice tight with a fear that instantly coiled in Alara's stomach. It was about Lily, her 7-year-old granddaughter, the one remaining flicker of light in Alara's dim world. A fever, Sarah had explained, one that had come on suddenly and burned with an unnatural intensity. The doctors were confused, their tests revealing nothing, their medicines having no effect. Alara rushed to the hospital, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found Lily in a sterile white room, her small face flushed, her body trembling beneath a thin blanket. The child who was normally a whirlwind of bright energy and endless questions was terrifyingly still. Her eyes, when they opened, were glassy and unfocused. Sarah sat beside the bed, her face pale and drawn, a mirror of the terror Alara now felt. Days bled into a week. Lily's fever did not break. It raged, a relentless fire that seemed to be consuming her from the inside out. Dr. Evans, a man whose pragmatic confidence usually offered comfort, grew grave. He spoke in hushed tones of unexplained febrile events, and inflammatory responses, his words were a clinical cloak for a simple, terrifying truth. He did not know what was wrong, and he did not know how to fix it. Alara kept a vigil with Sarah, the two women bound by a shared, unspeakable dread. The hospital became their world. The smell of antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the hushed footsteps of nurses in the hallway. In that crucible of fear, Alara's bitterness hardened into a sharp, jagged weapon. She watched Sarah murmur prayers, her daughter's face lifted in desperate supplication, and felt a cold, furious contempt. One night, she returned home for a few hours of restless sleep, the hospital's sterile scent clinging to her clothes. The house was cold and silent, its emptiness more profound than ever. Her eyes fell upon the mantelpiece, upon the serene, plaster face of the Virgin Mary statue. It seemed to be watching her, its placid expression a mockery of her torment. Something inside her snapped. A lifetime of grief, a week of terror, and a profound sense of cosmic injustice erupted in a single, volcanic burst of rage. This was the source of the false hope that poisoned the world. This was the empty promise that left people like Sarah whispering to an indifferent sky while children burned with fever. "Useless," she hissed, her voice a raw tear in the silence. "You are useless." She snatched the statue from the mantel. It felt cold and dead in her hand. She marched through the house and out the back door into the narrow, damp alley. The metal trash can stood against the brick wall, its lid slightly askew. With a guttural cry that was part grief and part curse, she threw the statue inside. It landed with a sickening clatter, a hollow sound of plaster hitting metal that echoed in the tight space. It was a sound of finality, of a final, definitive severing. She slammed the lid shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, she felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of defiant release. She had silenced one of God's empty promises. Then, a chilling hollowness washed over her, colder and more desolate than any grief she had ever known. She had not cast out a demon. She had only deepened her own despair. The act of desecration did not bring relief. It brought a deeper chill, a silence that was not empty but heavy with an unspoken judgment. Back in her house, the air felt different, thinner. The spot on the mantelpiece where the statue had stood seemed to pulse with a vacant energy, an accusation of its own. Alara tried to sleep, but the clattering sound of the falling statue echoed in her mind, a percussion to the frantic rhythm of her fear. At the hospital the next morning, the news was worse. Lily had suffered a seizure during the night. Her breathing was shallow, her small body now frighteningly frail. Dr. Evans met Alara and Sarah in the hallway, his face stripped of all professional detachment. His expression was one of compassionate defeat. "We're doing everything we can," he said, his voice low. "But her system is not responding. We need to be prepared." He did not need to finish the sentence. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Sarah collapsed into a fit of weeping, and Alara, her own body numb, could only hold her daughter, offering a comfort she did not feel. Her defiance had been a fool's errand. She had raged against heaven, and in response, the darkness had only drawn closer. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and terror. Alara rarely left the hospital, dozing in uncomfortable waiting room chairs, her mind a wasteland of regret and fear. Her hard shell of skepticism was cracking, ground down by the relentless abrasion of Lily's suffering. What if she was wrong? What if there was something more than a cold, empty universe, and she had just spat in its face? The thought was a new kind of terror, one that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. One evening, as she sat by Lily's bedside, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest, a strange scent filled the room. It was faint at first, then unmistakable. Roses. A deep, rich perfume of fresh-cut roses, blooming impossibly in the sterile, antiseptic air. She looked around, confused. There were no flowers in the room. She glanced at the nurse who was checking Lily's vitals, but the woman seemed to notice nothing. The scent lingered for a moment, a beautiful, phantom presence, and then it was gone. Alara dismissed it. A trick of a tired mind, a hallucination born of stress and lack of sleep. But 2 nights later, it happened again. She was dozing in the waiting room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, when a sound drifted into her consciousness. It was a melody, a soft, ethereal humming, like a mother's lullaby. It was profoundly peaceful, a gentle current in the stagnant ocean of hospital noise. Her eyes snapped open. The waiting room was empty save for a janitor mopping the floor at the far end of the hall. The sound was gone. Her rational mind fought for control, supplying logical explanations. An open door, a radio playing softly somewhere, her own mind playing tricks on her. Yet, a part of her, a small, terrified, and long-dormant part, knew that what she was experiencing was not normal. It was as if something was gently knocking on the locked door of her soul. The crisis reached its peak on the third week. Lily's breathing became ragged, the monitors beside her bed beeping with a new, frantic urgency. Nurses rushed in. Dr. Evans was summoned. He worked over the child with a grim focus, but Alara could see the futility in his movements. He was fighting a battle that was already lost. Sarah was led from the room, sobbing hysterically. Alara remained, frozen just inside the doorway, a silent witness to the final, flickering moments of her granddaughter's life. Hope was no longer just lost, it was a cruel joke. Her defiance, her anger, her grief, it all dissolved into a single, overwhelming feeling of absolute, crushing despair. She was powerless, completely and utterly powerless. She stumbled back into the hallway, collapsing into a chair in a deserted family lounge. The world seemed to tilt and fade. This was the end, the final, punctuation mark on a life of loss. The darkness she had courted had finally come to claim everything. It was in this moment of ultimate surrender, not to faith, but to utter desolation, that she finally closed her eyes and fell. But she did not fall into the oblivion of sleep. She fell through it, into somewhere else. She was no longer in the cold, sterile hospital. She was standing in her own garden. But it was not the choked, dying patch of weeds behind her house. It was transformed. The roses Mateo had planted were in full, impossible bloom, their petals the color of dawn and velvet. The grass was a lush, green carpet under her bare feet, and the air was alive with the scent of damp earth and sweet blossoms. A soft, silvery blue light bathed everything, a light that did not come from a sun, but seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Before her stood a woman. She was tall and slender, wrapped in a mantle the color of the twilight sky. Her face was beautiful, but it was a beauty forged in sorrow. Her eyes, the color of a deep, calm sea, held an ocean of love and a pain that mirrored Alara's own. She did not look like the chipped plaster statue. She was alive, breathing, real. And in her presence, Alara felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of peace, a feeling of being known, completely and profoundly. The woman did not speak with her lips. The message flowed directly into Alara's mind, a current of pure understanding that was gentler than a whisper, but clearer than a shout. He did not take your love. He holds it for you. The thought was a balm on the raw wound of Alara's grief for Mateo. It did not erase the pain, but it transformed it, recasting it not as an ending, but as a safekeeping. Your child waits for you. The words were not a promise of a cure in the way Alara would have understood it. They were a statement of a deeper truth, a reassurance that life and love were not contained by the fragile vessel of the body. Then, a final thought, softer than the rest, like an echo carried on the light. My son waits for you. And with that, the immense, sorrowful love of the woman washed over Alara, through her, cleansing the bitterness and rage, filling the hollow spaces with a light she had forgotten existed. The beautiful, impossible garden began to fade, the blue light receding like a gentle tide. Alara awoke with a gasp, her body jerking upright in the waiting room chair. Her face was wet with tears. The stale air of the hospital filled her lungs, but she could still smell the phantom scent of roses. The crushing weight that had settled on her chest for years, the heavy stone of her grief, was gone. It had not vanished, but had been lifted, leaving behind not a void, but a profound, trembling peace. For a long moment, she simply sat there, weeping. But these were not the hot, angry tears of sorrow she had shed for Mateo, nor the cold, terrified tears she had shed for Lily. These were tears of release, of awe, of a repentance so deep it felt as if her very soul was being washed clean. The hardness within her had been broken, and through the cracks, grace was pouring in. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge was not a thought, but a deep, primal instinct. She stood up, her movements clumsy, and walked out of the hospital. She did not tell Sarah where she was going. She did not have the words to explain. She drove home in a daze, the familiar streets of her town looking new and strange, as if she were seeing them for the first time. She did not go in the front door. She went directly to the alley, to the cold metal trash can standing like a tombstone against the wall. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. The stench of garbage rose up to meet her, but she did not flinch. She began to dig, pushing aside bags of refuse and old newspapers, her fingers searching frantically. She did not care about the filth, the grime that stained her hands and clothes. She was a treasure hunter searching for the most precious jewel in the world. And then her fingers brushed against something cool and hard. She pulled it out. It was the statue. It was grimy and stained, and a piece of the blue mantle near the base had broken off, leaving a stark white wound in the plaster. But the serene face was intact, the gentle eyes seeming to look up at her not with judgment, but with that same, patient love she had seen in the garden. Alara sank to her knees on the damp pavement of the alley, clutching the broken effigy to her chest. She pressed her forehead against the cool plaster. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words a choked sob. Her apology was not just for the act of throwing it away. It was for everything. For the years of bitterness, for the closed heart, for the pride that had walled her up in a prison of her own making. "I am so sorry." She stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the filth of the alley, holding the broken statue as if it were a living thing. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the rooftops. A new day was beginning, and for Alara, so was a new life. Clutching the broken statue, Alara returned to the hospital. She walked with a purpose she had not felt in years, her heart no longer a stone but a vessel filled with a fragile, tremulous hope. When she entered Lily's room, the scene was unchanged. The machines still beeped their anxious rhythm, and her granddaughter lay terribly still, a pale doll in the enormous bed. Sarah was asleep in a chair, her face etched with exhaustion even in slumber. Quietly, Alara went to the bedside. She wiped the statue clean with the hem of her sleeve and placed it on the small rolling table next to the force-stand. The broken, chipped plaster looked small and insignificant amidst the medical equipment. Yet, for Alara, it was the most powerful thing in the room. She did not pray in the old way, with demands or bargains. She did not ask for a miracle. She simply sat down, took Lily's small, limp hand in hers, and surrendered. She opened her heart and poured out her love, her sorrow, her newfound gratitude, letting it flow into the quiet space of the room. She just sat, holding her granddaughter's hand, a silent, humble vigil of faith reborn. Hours passed. The morning sun streamed through the window, painting stripes of light across the floor. Sarah stirred and woke, her eyes finding Alara and then the broken statue. A question formed on her lips, but she did not ask it. She saw the profound change in her mother's face, the absence of hardness, the presence of a deep, resonant peace, and simply took her other hand. It was then that Lily moved. A tiny flicker of her eyelids, a small sigh. Her fingers twitched in Alara's grasp. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She and Sarah leaned forward, their hearts pounding in unison. Lily's eyes slowly fluttered open, but they were not glassy and unfocused anymore. They were clear. They were her own. She looked at her grandmother, a faint, sleepy smile touching her lips. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "The pretty lady in the blue dress said you were coming." Tears streamed down Alara's face as Sarah let out a cry that was half sob, half laugh, and rushed to call a nurse. Moments later, the room was a flurry of activity. Dr. Evans arrived, his expression one of utter disbelief. He checked Lily's temperature. The raging fever that had battled his every modern medicine for weeks was gone. Completely. Her vitals were stabilizing, her breathing even. He ran tests. He examined his charts. He could find no medical reason for the sudden, complete reversal. He looked from the recovering child to the weeping mother and grandmother, and then his eyes landed on the small, broken statue on the bedside table. He, a man of science and logic, a man who dealt in facts and figures, simply shook his head. "I can't explain it," he admitted, his voice filled with a humility Alara had never heard from him before. "It's a miracle." The story of Lily's recovery was not proclaimed from the church pulpit or printed in the local paper. It spread the way morning light spreads, quietly and gently, first through the family, then to their closest friends. When Alara returned the statue to Mr. Anya, explaining what had happened, the old man did not act surprised. He simply took her hand, his own eyes shining with tears, and said, "Maria always knew. Faith is strongest in the mended places." Alara was a different woman. The ghost that haunted her home was gone, replaced by a person who opened the curtains and let in the light. She started in the garden. With her own hands, she pulled the weeds and trimmed the thorns, slowly bringing the vibrant tapestry she and Mateo had loved back to life. It was hard work, but every pruned branch and new bloom felt like an act of prayer. She did not become a preacher. Her transformation was not loud. It was a quiet, deep-running river. She began attending the small stone church again, not out of duty, but out of a simple, humble gratitude. She shared her story only when she met another soul drowning in a grief as deep as her own had been, offering not easy answers, but her quiet, compassionate presence. A few weeks later, she took the broken statue to a local artisan, a woman who specialized in the Japanese art of kintsugi. The artisan did not try to hide the break. Instead, she carefully filled the crack and reattached the chipped piece using lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The result was breathtaking. The statue was whole again, but the jagged golden line that now traced its way across the blue mantle told its story. It was a story of being broken and being made whole again, not by hiding the damage, but by illuminating it. With the permission of the priest, the mended statue was placed in a small, quiet alcove of the church. It became a silent testament for the whole town, a symbol that faith, like pottery, could be shattered and become even more beautiful and precious in its restoration. Alara, Sarah, and a fully recovered, vibrant Lily would often visit it, a quiet family whose lives had been broken and then mended by a love that defied all explanation. Alara would look at the golden seam, a scar of grace, and remember that it was only when she had been completely emptied of her own strength that she had finally been filled. The story of Alara is a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments of grief and doubt, when we feel most abandoned, we may be closest to a profound grace. Her journey from bitter rejection to humble surrender shows us that faith is not about the absence of suffering, but about what we find on the other side of it. Sometimes, our most beautiful transformations begin when we are at our most broken. If this story of hope and healing touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational stories. Share this video with someone you know who might be going through a difficult time and could use a reminder that light can be found even in the deepest darkness. And we would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or a time when you experienced unexpected hope. Thank you for watching.